This phenomenon that all of us in this field are trying to dig into and trying to understand, I say we do have skin in the game. It is up to us to try to parse this mystery because we are a part of it.
Welcome to New Realities. I'm Alan Steinfeld. I'm very excited about this guest tonight. Alexis Brooks will be a keynote speaker at the upcoming Contact in the Desert, May 30th to June 3rd, 2024. Tickets are at contactinthedesert.com.
Circular-shaped, unidentified objects have been reported. 3 shiny objects in the sky attracted my attention.
The unidentified object moved slowly down the Pacific coast and disappeared.
Tonight's episode is Aliens and Phobias. Welcome to New Realities. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and this program has been about the last few years, what's going on with UAPs, UFOs, ETs, how is that interfacing with our lives in a very deep way. And so I want to talk to this woman, Alexis Brooks. She has her own podcast, Higher Journeys with Alexis Brooks, on YouTube, on podcasting. She also does a show on the History Channel.
It's called The Proof is Out There, Alan. The proof is indeed out there.
And as we'll find today, it's also in here, because what I really want to talk to you about is your deep work that needs to be said about abductions, alien abductions, which I think I've had. I've written about that in my book. And so many people. And when you told me something like more people than they know have had these experiences, it just sparked something. I think that's so true. I think. And what makes you think that, though?
Well, look, Alan, I have been kind of chipping away at this theory, this idea that contact may be more of a ubiquitous mass phenomenon. For about 5 or 6 years, I actually gave a lecture initially in Australia back in 2019, where I was asked to talk about the contact phenomenon. People that know my show and that know my work know that my entry point into this entire field is sort of predicated on the experiential aspect versus lights in the sky, which we're talking a lot about lately. And so as you dig more into this idea of contact, what is it, who's having it, and under what premise, it occurred to me that as like you know, we're not only talking amongst each other, we're talking to normal people, you know, our neighbors, our friends, family members, you know, our coworkers. And for our work, both of us as journalists, I have no problem letting people know this is what part and parcel of what I do. It's not all that I do in my work. But as I talk to people over the years, rather than getting you're crazy, I've never gotten that, by the way. I get stories. And I get a really heightened interest at a minimum in the subject. And as I sort of canvassed the people that I talked to over the years, not to mention the people that reach out to me through my show, I asked the question, and this is the big thing. It's not about proof that this is happening, but the question, could contact be happening on a much broader scale? And so that was sort of the impetus for me to dig into, if it is, what would the clues to contact be? And thus the work began. It hasn't stopped. I'm really just scratching the surface.
This is so exciting. It's true. So what are the clues to contact?
There are many.
Like, give me some. So,
Well, you know, when I started researching for my initial presentation, which is, by the way, called Unconscious Contact, Are You an Experiencer and Don't Know It? I wanted to begin with something kind of fundamental to the human experience, and that has to do with phobias. Many of us have some kind of phobia. And, you know, as I look at phobias, you can take some of the more common ones like fear of heights, fear of public speaking, fear of snakes, things that we talk about and know about, and a lot of people have on a day-to-day basis. I put those aside, Alan, and started to look at some of the lesser discussed but equally prevalent phobias, like fear of clowns. That's the first thing I looked into.
I got that.
Are you one of? Do you really? Okay. Well, here we go. Let's get this conversation started. Fear of clowns, by the way, is called coulrophobia.
Mhm.
It is this, not just fear, but disgust of the
Well,
clown character.
I wouldn't say I avoid it, but there's something about how do clowns fit into with
Well,
aliens?
I'll tell you. Let's
Yeah.
talk about it. Let's dig into that a little bit. The initial question I asked about this idea of a fear of clowns perhaps being linked to possible contact came from a mutual colleague who her name is Mary Rodwell, who's done some stellar research in the hypnotherapy area, and she is a hypnotherapist. And I had her on my show, I don't know, maybe 6-7 years ago at this point, where we talked about a particular case where I believe it was a friend of her son's who had had a motorcycle accident and but felt that there was a missing gap in time, something that he couldn't quite clarify. Fortunately, it wasn't a serious accident, but there were some missing elements to it. And so he decided to be regressed. And when he was regressed by Mary, it was discovered that when she went deep and started asking questions, he described what he thought to be some sort of a being, but wearing clown shoes, had approached him. And at that point, she said, let's call him John. She said, John, let's take this a little bit deeper. I want you to look again at the shoes. Tell me now what you see. And he paused. And obviously, I haven't heard the tape, but what she described, he said, was more akin to an alien-like being. Let's call it a gray, if you will. Dug deeper, and he began to describe what was not a clown, but was a being that we would call extraterrestrial, as an example. Well, that was really the beginning for me starting to look at this even more deeply and discovering that, Alan, when you go to search for, I have a fear of, let's say you go on Google and say, I have a fear of fill in the blank, clowns pops right up. I think it was number 3 when I was doing my research.
Wow.
So it's ubiquitous. Now here's a term I just want to, before we leave this
please
area,
go ahead. Yes, thank you.
this is a term that's commonly known as screen memory. She was calling this a possible screen memory that this gentleman was having, where the brain, either our brain or perhaps the technology of the beings we're interfacing with, may have the ability to put a screen, rather than allowing our brains to process that we're seeing something that could be so hideous. They will put something that we're familiar with, but we'll emerge from the experience with a phobia or fear. Look, the brain is so magnanimous in its capacity to do both. Well, first of all, we don't even really understand what the brain is and how it functions, but it does have this innate ability, it seems, to shut down areas that we feel we can't handle, illuminate other areas that we may be able to handle or need to see. And so I've asked that question, Alan, could it be that we're participating in creating the screen, or the beings themselves have some ability? We've heard about this speculative but ability nonetheless on the part of the beings to wipe memory altogether. Hence another reason why I asked the question, could many more people be having contact than even realize, because memory has been completely wiped. So there's so many things.
So important what you're doing, Alexis, because I think they say, and other people have said, the post-disclosure world, they're here. What are they doing here? This is like crucial. How many people are they abducting? I mean, the Roper poll of 1992 said it was like 2 or 3%, which is still millions of people. But are you saying it could be as high as 50 or 60 or 70%?
Absolutely. I am saying that it could be. And I have to preface by saying we're looking at clues. I cannot say definitively, but based on my research, other colleagues that I've talked to, we're in agreement that this is far more common, cross-cultural, cross-religion, cross-history of a phenomenon than we could even imagine. Now, I want to bring something up here because, look, we have been so conditioned to have this idea of contact in very narrow parameters. And I think a lot of this has to do with the way the media has historically framed what that is and who they are. When my sense is that we're dealing with perhaps a spectrum of intelligence, a spectrum of motivations, and a spectrum of what we wouldn't even call the classic extraterrestrial. We're not even talking about, or we should be, elementals, orb-like beings, the angelic realm,
Yeah.
shadow being visits, of which is hugely common. You know,
Yeah.
we have these sort of narrow parameters that we have used to define what contact is. Another thing, I'm just going to throw all this out there, and then you know we can have a conversation around it, and that is the idea of what we call individuals that have had encounters. We started out with calling them, I think, more abductees, which is an implication that an abductee is someone that has been taken against their will. The term then expanded to contactees, which has a little bit more of a benign connotation, less invasive. And then thanks to the late Dr. John Mack in the 90s, I believe he was the one that coined the phrase experiencer. So when we take the even the change in terminology over the years, we're now looking at a broader entry point into what experience could entail, which would include the angelic realm, you know, ghostly contact, elemental contact, to shadow being, to what, you know, some cultures call demonic even. But so I think once we take all that into account, we're certainly talking about a lot more people that have had some form of experience.
Yeah, no, this is so important. It's especially important for me because I am working on a abduction case from a historic figure that really hasn't been investigated. I'm looking something that this person didn't even know happened, but I'm looking for clues within the biographical background of how this has happened, and the evidence that seems to add up to, oh my God, this person in history was abducted. And I'll let you know when that comes out. But just want to talk about so much that you brought up. First of all, in my own personal experience, of course, they follow generational. And my mother has a very intense phobia about cats. And I said, what is it about cats that really scares you? She says, well, it's the eyes. It's the slanty eyes. The other thing about my mother and my grandmother, her mother, they went out to Tucson one summer. It happened to be the summer of 1947, when they would get lost in the mountains of Tucson. So, and so I do think it's generational, the abduction, and I do think they are fine tuning our genetics. That's a whole other conversation, but it's all the evidence I have is that my grandmother and my mother and me, and maybe not my father or my other brothers, form this abduction lineage. Does that sound true?
The intergenerational component, Alan, is probably one of the most fascinating elements to this whole puzzle. I've run into it more times than I can count at this point. Again, we want to be so careful that we don't paint this with such both a broad, well, we have to paint it with a broad brush, but we don't narrow the parameters so much that we exclude a lot of other things. But the intergenerational link seems to be something that is that comes up a lot, I know, in my work. And what I will do, you know, as I talk to people and sort of canvass the area and survey individuals, lay people, and we get into a conversation where the individual may think that they are being contacted, I will invariably ask, well, what about your ancestry? What about your mother? What about your father? What about your, you know, not in all cases, but in more times than not, I will say that even if they have to sort of think about it, well, my mother once told me a story of, I don't know what, when she was a child, and the stories go on. And, you know, here's the thing, Alan, and you know, as a researcher, it can be so frustrating because we're not dealing with hard science. We're not dealing with the instruments that science is used to using to measure the phenomenon. We're dealing largely with anecdotal data. But so be it. You know, I love, there's this quote by physicist Dana Zohar where she says, science denies these experiences because they don't have the instruments of the moment to measure it. And it could very well be that we never will have the instruments that we're using. The instrument is here. The instrument is the brain and the heart and the memory, and also recovering those memories. So, you know, we're going to have to kind of reevaluate the criteria that we use to judge what is contact and how many people are having it and to what extent.
No, this work is so, I think it is the most important work in the UFO ET phenomena. It needs to be said, it needs to be public. We need to investigate the deeper parts of ourselves that, of course, John Mack was so instrumental in saying these people with experiences are having something real happen to them. he qualified, quantified, and legitimized it. So that lead by a Harvard psychiatrist, head of the Harvard Medical School of Psychiatry, and with his background and his open-mindedness, changed the landscape of what was possible for people to accept. So what are some other elements that beside, clowns, owls?
Well, let's talk about the phobias that I
please. Yes.
incorporated into my my lecture.
Yes.
There were about 5 that I targeted, Alan, even though I think there are even more, but 5 that I could sort of look at as having a definitive possible connection to contact. Another one, interestingly, is helianthrophobia, which is fear of sunflowers. Fear of sunflowers.
I never heard of that one.
Nor had I, until it was a dear friend of mine, actually my best friend, and we spent a lot of time talking about these sort of things. She doesn't call them contact encounters, but she does talk about some of the more anomalous experiences she's had throughout her life. And in the course of conversation over the years, she came, we were having a conversation. She said, a friend of mine the other day brought sunflowers to my house, and I don't know if I've ever told you this, Alexis, but I can't stand them. I have a fear of them, actually. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Now, instead of just kind of laughing it off, I said, let's look at this kind of dot connecting, right? Connecting the dots. I looked at, and I happen to love sunflowers, but I looked at an image of, and some of them can be huge. They're like, plate size. What do you see there in the center? What could resemble 2 things? Some of the craft that have been described as having this sort of underbelly that's not only illuminated, but just very huge, oversized, but also the eyes of some of the beings that have been described. Well, I was kind of taking this story in a vacuum until I started researching it, and come to find out the phobia is widespread enough that they named it helianthrophobia. And so I put that in the bucket of possible in some cases. I mean, why would you be afraid of a flower?
Well, that's really interesting, because the other side of phobia is fascination. And I'm fascinated with sunflowers. So I think, depending on maybe your disposition, relationship,
sure,
also key. Are you fascinated, or are they just another flower? No, I'm fascinated with sunflowers. So thank you for that, Alexis. Thank you.
Yeah. Very interesting. That's a very good point you make, Alan, that the other side of phobia could be fascination, just intrigue. Akin to how a lot of people feel about this phenomenon that we're talking about, right? They're intrigued by it. They're curious about it. What is this made of? Okay, so that's another phobia. So we've got coulrophobia, helianthrophobia, and here's another, something called trypophobia, which is fear of compartments, holes like a honeycomb, or bumps. Trypophobia. And I thought, aha, here's another one we can put in this bucket. Again, for your audience, I want to be clear, disclaimer, I am not saying at all that they're definitively linked to contact, but they're interesting little tidbits that you could possibly link. Here's where I make the connection. When you look at a honeycomb as an example, an area where there's compartments, think of some of the people that have, particularly in regression, have talked about being on board craft, and they saw what appeared to be multiple pods of almost like birthing pods, where they would see these hybrid beings in these compartments, holes, little compartments being incubated. This has come up more than once. I don't know about in your research, but it's come up for me, where people talk about what they see on craft. And among other things, they have seen these multiple birthing pods with not only hybrid looking creatures, but human looking creatures. Right. I believe there's a scene in the original Matrix movie that shows something like this.
Yes. I actually, when I saw that Matrix movie, I said, he's portraying an abduction scene. Anyway, yes.
Could be. Yeah. So I linked it to that as a possibility. The other thing that made me think trypophobia could be tangentially connected is how many experiencers have seen very strange patterns of marks on the body.
Yeah.
Right? With no conscious link. Me too, actually. So there's another for you. So now we're talking 3. Let's go into another one. Something called pedophobia, or fear of children. Fear of children. This isn't fear of having children. the people that have this all-on phobia can't even look at pictures of children or see them in media.
Well,
So I thought, okay.
I just want to say related to that is a sort of fear of dolls.
Oh, yes.
Isn't
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
Not
Well,
children, because I mean, we all love children, but dolls is those
yeah, but
staring.
this is a specific fear of children. It didn't even,
Oh,
yeah. Look, I'm glad you brought that up because
yeah.
when we talk about these things, you know, we've got to be very, very cautious about how definitive we are in linking these things. We cannot exclude the damage that media, mainstream media, our film, Hollywood has done in framing these images, the scary clown and the creepy doll, as being linked to something evil.
Right.
I want to be able to push that aside and say, let's push that aside. We already know that's already in the subconscious because we've seen these movies. I'm talking about taking another part of this. I don't think these phobias emerge solely because of these movies. They're coming from somewhere else. They may be supported by, you know.
I do think, though, those phobias in the film that created are by people who've actually had those abduction experience, and they're masking it this way, right?
It could be. It very well could. I was just going to say, yeah, good point. Good point. So, fear of children, pedophobia. That's a deep one, and that one really made me sort of stand back and think, where might this be linked? Well, I came up with two things on this, two ideas as well. One, many people who eventually discover that they may have been having contact for a lifetime, when do the experiences begin? As a child. Now, perhaps an individual could go through an entire lifetime and not have triggers is something else that I look into in terms of contact, or realizing you're having contact encounters. It may not be happening until you're in your senior years. But let's say an individual goes for a regression and discovers it's been a lifelong process, but all the while they never wanted to have children or were afraid of children. But then they discover that they have been having encounters since childhood. That could be a link that one might, to justify why one might be afraid of children, because they don't want, again, we're talking about the brain and how it may be conveniently blocking certain traumatic experiences as a survival mechanism, for one thing. One more.
Yeah, tell me, because the fear of children for me is about the ETs being little beings that
you could add that too.
Like the end of Close Encounters, all these little ETs come out, but they're played by children who are about 5 or 6 years old. So that's when you say fear of children. It's like the ET. Lots of people describe some of these ETs as childlike or as children. So it wasn't the children itself, but it's the beings that first appear as children that is so freaky, because that's our association. So no, tell me the rest. I love this research.
You make a good point. You could also see, there's so much crossover, Alan, in all of the things that we're talking about. We want to, again, not be too quick to narrowly frame each thing. There's crossover. You think about, again, screen memory. Could the fear of children be some deeply recessed memory that the conscious is not accessing, but the brain is screening, thinking that it was a child that frightened you when it was actually a being, but was screened as a child? But another possible link could be that don't let me lose my train of thought here. Missing pregnancies, and both male and female who have told explicit stories of both sperm and ova being taken out of them, and then later being brought on board craft to see these children, being told that they belong to them. I've heard myriad stories. I'm thinking of one person right now, Geraldine, help me, I know you know her.
Geraldine Orozco?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And she's been so brave to come forward and talk about her experiences in that regard and beyond. But so again, all of these have multiple entry points as to how they could possibly be linked. Now, look, let's go back to my thesis of unconscious contact being far more common. When you take all of these things into consideration, and I haven't even told you the fifth one, and they're more.
Mhm.
And this is just phobias as one entry point.
Right.
When you look at I haven't gotten the numbers on this, but the numbers of people that have any kind of phobia, right, worldwide, automatically your numbers are going to go up. Now, again, we've got to take into consideration that not all phobias emanate from a contact encounter, but even if it were a 20% percentile that did, we're talking about a lot more people having contact than
Right.
we are admitting.
Right. Right.
So,
I mean, fear of heights is one that I'm thinking about. Fear of, I don't know. I mean, just fear
there's so
of
many. Fear of needles,
needles.
fear of white coats,
Yeah, fear
fear
of
of being on
doctors and
hospital bed.
fear of doctors in general.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
Yeah,
many of them.
I
So
know. So,
many of them.
but okay, tell me the last one, but then I have questions about the whole scope of the phenomena. So, what's the
Mhm.
last?
The last one that not again, I have a few more in the presentation, but another one that stood out for me is called somnophobia, fear of sleep. Now, this is not to be confused with insomnia, which is a fear that you can't go to sleep, but the fear of going to sleep. And again, this wasn't a hard one for me. I've talked to a number of individuals who claim contact being taken from their bedroom and
Mhm.
being brought back and having a whole litany of symptoms after the fact, not being able to sleep or a fear of going to sleep, because in some cases the witness or the experiencer is woken up out of a sound sleep and taken on board craft. I'm thinking of
Right.
one person right now
Mm.
who I've talked to in great detail, and that's Reverend Michael J.S. Carter,
I know
who
Michael
has
Carter.
been,
Yeah.
yeah, who
Yeah.
he's great, and he's been very, very courageous in talking about the trepidation that he suffered and the struggles that he's had in not only dealing with his contact encounters, but really trying to justify them. He's been, and also at the same time being very grateful for his experiences and how much he's learned. But
Mhm.
for him, he
Mhm.
still has an issue turning off his light because of the things that
Me
have happened to him in his bedroom.
I was going to say that I had a fear growing up. I had to sleep with the light on. My father would come in and say, "You're wasting electricity every morning." But it's like with the radio on and the lights on. The other thing about sleep, I have a fear, I think I've gotten over it, of my feet sticking out under the blanket. So my feet have to be covered, or else it's like I feel someone's going to grab my feet. And have you heard about that before?
Of course,
Oh, okay, good.
absolutely. I have. That's interesting. You should bring that up. Another story for another time. I think what is so fascinating about all that we're talking about, Alan, is really we're looking at the human psyche and
Mhm.
how much we don't know about ourselves.
Yes.
This phenomenon that all of us in this field are trying to dig into and trying to understand, I say we do have skin in the game. It is up to us to try to parse this mystery because we are a part of it. I was quoted in a book by Miguel Mendonça, great British author, who wrote 2 volumes on called "We Are the Disclosure." And there's some great people, some of them gone now, that were interviewed, like Stanton Friedman and Jim Mars, and oh gosh, so many individuals. And I was really fortunate to have been included in the first volume. And he asked me as a part of my interview, Alexis, what do you think this is all about? Why, what's the significance of disclosure, but what is the purpose of it? And I said, Miguel, quite simply, the biggest discovery is self-discovery. We're trying to understand the multifaceted aspects of self. And I don't think we're ever going to have a complete answer to the question or have the mystery solved until we have more insight into our level of interaction with other forms of intelligence, of which I'm sure we're having.
Don't you think part of it could also be the hybridization program, because it's generational? The fact that they've reached the end is my theory, the end of their evolutionary cycle. They need to have our genetics, which contain our emotionality, and an upgrade for us. I mean, I think every generation, because it's generational, they are upgrading not the physical, but also mental capacities, and maybe the artistic creative capacities of each person generationally. So there'll be an interbreeding connection when it gets 3 or 4 generations down the line. So yes, I think that it is about our awakening to ourselves, but they have skin in the game too.
Yeah.
They're getting something
Well,
out of it.
sure. I think that could be part of the answer, but I always try to zoom out and say, first of all, who are they? Which they? I think, we're potentially talking about hundreds of different species, which
Mhm.
could be hundreds of different motivations, including motivations for connecting with us.
Right.
So where your theory and those like you is plausible and could be true, I think that there could be other motivations as well.
Mhm. Right.
Uh, the
And
the
I do,
fact that
yeah,
I'll just say this,
no,
the
please.
fact or the idea you talk about our own, Homo sapiens sapien being a hybridized species ourselves, could some of the contact encounters simply be ancestral links? So, and the motivation thereof would be to reconnect, forgive the not cliche, but um, a reunion of sorts, a family reunion of sorts.
Mm.
I just think that there's so many motivations.
Yeah, I agree. There's probably a lot, and you've probably been taken or abducted by more than one species for more than one purpose. And I do tend to agree with David Jacobs, who I don't agree with mostly, but he does trace the modern phenomena back to the late 19th century. And this is when H.G. Wells wrote A War of the Worlds. There was, and maybe it's just the move towards modernism that had disconnected us from a kind of spiritual past, but something seemed to have begun
Hmm.
around like the airship craze in the US that was over the
Yeah,
West. Something, I mean, this is just my theory. Something, Richard Dolan, I think, agrees with this too. Something about the modern phenomenon separated from the fairy contact and maybe the devil monster thing, but maybe not. Maybe this is just a modern perspective that we're overlaying.
right. Well, we're also talking about the Western thinking versus, let's say, the indigenous cultures who have a very different picture, or
Mhm.
let's say a more diverse picture of what this all constitutes. I mean, look, you're crossing over into so many different, traditions and oral traditions, many
Yeah.
of them. I mean, let's look at Skinwalker Ranch as
Mhm.
as an example. A story that continues to intrigue and scare the living what out of a lot of people as to what's going on there. But let's look at what territory we're talking about there in Utah. We're talking about Native Americans that have traditions. Now, I'm not well schooled on the history of Skinwalker. I just know a little bit about, where the name comes from and what may be happening there. But the Native Americans, I guarantee you that the indigenous people there, their description of what that's all about and what it means is probably going to be vastly different than, let's say, those of us that are, in more of a left brain, trying to understand the science of what's going on. So I think we have to be very accommodating
Mhm.
to the different distillations depending on where you're coming from,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, where the shadow people phenomenon, as an example, Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who I miss dearly,
Yeah.
she was a close friend and colleague, and I worked with her for years, was studying the shadow person phenomenon intently, but she was convinced that it was connected directly to the jinn, the genie, of which
Mhm.
derives from the Islamic culture.
Right. We first need for the phenomena to be accepted publicly. I mean, people like Whitley Strieber is an incredible
Mm.
spokesperson for this movement. I want to ask you, do you think the phenomenon is happening as much as it was from the
Uh,
Benny and Barney Hill days, 60s, 70s, 80s? I think, this is my theory, it reached a peak in the 90s. And then I haven't had any experiences, I don't think, since the early 2000s, and other people haven't. So what's your theory about, did they get what they came for and they're left?
I
Or
think it's ongoing,
you
and
do?
I think it could be that what we formally described as contact or abductions may have morphed into something different.
Mm, mm,
People are, I know, contacting me saying that they're now becoming aware of the fact that they're having contact encounters
Mhm.
and dreams. A lot. No, we can talk about this, and I go into this in my presentation: physical versus non-physical contact. And I know, speaking of David Jacobs, he has a lot to say, had a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
But to what extent are contact encounters happening? Could they be happening in the dreamscape? And
Mm.
we're dreaming every night. I know a lot of people are talking about in the last several years how their dreams have become even more curious as it relates to this phenomenon. So I'll say, Alan, the jury's out. There's no way of knowing. And a lot of people will argue, well, if rather than abductions or contact happening more now, it could just very well be that the conversation is becoming bigger now. I don't know.
When I talk about alien abductions or anything like that, to the normal, what do they call that in Harry Potter movies? The muggles, right? The people who are,
Oh yeah.
that's what Harry Potter calls it. The people who are not into any of this. It seems so ridiculous. It seemed like, I know it's true, but to talk to someone who's sitting home watching the football game, or I mean, like most of my family, but they're nice people, but it's like, it's such, I mean, we can talk about it, and I get what you're saying, and I feel it. And there's a whole population that thinks we're really crazy. I'll just say that. But of course, just one more thing, you get people like Lou Alexander was asked, what do you think of abductions? And he did not deflect it. He says, this is a serious crime and invasion. He totally went with it. So anyway, but back to the thing, how do we reach the people that think this is totally ridiculous?
Well, I want to say something about that, Alan. This is important. Also, something I address in this whole thesis, and that has to do with dissonance. It has to do with denial, and it has to do with those individuals that you're describing. I actually talked to Barbara Lamb, someone else that I know included her, and I included her in my presentation, and had her tell a story of a one individual who she was involved. I don't know if she still is, in the local MUFON organization in Southern California, where she is. And she described this gentleman who would come not only to the MUFON meetings, but to support groups that she ran. But it would seem that his motivation for coming would be to debunk the legitimacy of the phenomenon.
Right.
Well, fast forward, he would come religiously to these meetings, but it would seem that he was just kind of getting his fill of being the skeptic and debunking everyone. Well, it turns out over time, what was happening is he was confronting the fact that he was having encounters all along. And so part of my thesis is that those individuals that are watching the football game and drinking the beer and laughing, having a laugh at our stories, may be using some of these people as coping mechanisms. Because look, we're talking about something that, as a matter of fact, I want to mention Representative Tim Burchett, is it, or Burkett? Burchett.
Yeah.
Did you hear about the recent interview that he gave, and the fact that I'm digressing, but to make a point, he's part of the Congressional Oversight Committee that will be having yet another hearing based on the Grush report. Yeah. And the title of this article that I found on Fox News, he says, he sits on the House Oversight Committee hearings, said he was shown classified footage that hasn't been released to the public. And he says, after seeing this footage, he says, we can't handle it. That's his assessment. We can't handle it. Based on the behavior of these people that want to just laugh us out the door. And by the way, I haven't run into any of those people personally, which is an interesting thing. And I talk to a lot of people. I'll give you one quick example of a good friend of mine who years ago we had a conversation about all things paranormal, and she admitted to me that shortly after her grandmother died, she saw an image of her grandmother wide awake at the foot of her bed. And she looked at me straight in my eyes and she said, Alexis, I'm not going to believe it. Not that she experienced it, and she just decided, I'm just going to shut it out.
My experiences, and when I had an abduction experience in 1987, I didn't want to have a regression. I was too freaked out. It did suck me down the rabbit hole. I met Bud Hopkins. I met John Mack, 87. I was like unnerved and obsessed at the same time. And then it wasn't until I met James Peniston from the Rendlesham Forest when he was testifying in Washington. And I talked to him personally and said, well, what was your psychological effect after, touching the craft? He said, every night since then, this was like 2013, from 1980, he said he's taken a sedative to go to sleep every
Yeah.
single night. And I said, wow, if James Peniston, who touched the craft, I somehow that stimulated me to get my own regression. And I did, and I saw a little more of what happened to me when I was traveling cross country. But that night after the regression, they looked like birds to me, and I wasn't afraid. Were standing around my bed looking over me like sort of thanking me. It was so strange. All I could think was like big birds. People think of owls, but it was, so I think dreams, they are in our dreams, and I think it's so deep and confusing and obsessive.
It's so deep and confusing. And I'm so glad you brought up Jim Peniston from the Rendlesham Forest incident. That's something else that I touch on in my presentation, insofar as what he was able to deduce after touching that craft. He saw triangles, but he also started to decode what we would call binary code, zeros and ones, and tried to pinpoint where those zeros and ones were pointing to. And I believe he believed there were latitude and longitude points.
It was translated by an expert and they pinpointed places all over the planet, like Sedona and some other, what we know is
absolutely, which is fascinating. So here's where I link that, having to do with this yet another ubiquitous phenomenon of people seeing 1111 all the time. Now, I think it's a whole litany of different number patterns, which is another conversation. But could it be that some, and I stress some of these beings, may work very, very closely with the language of numbers and maybe trying to make contact vis-a-vis these numbers? I interviewed several individuals, in addition to presenting the work of Jim Peniston and the zeros and ones, that were channeling images either after their contact encounters or during the contact encounters, that included pictures of craft with zeros and ones around the image. So again, how many people are now talking about this 1111 phenomenon? I had a friend who just last week came to me and said, Alexis, and she knew nothing about the connection, how big this thing was. Why do I keep looking at the clock and seeing 1111? And I just started laughing. I said, Sonia, here's what's going on. And she couldn't believe what I was saying. She said, you mean other people are having this? And I said, you mean to tell me you don't know about this phenomenon? So can't say for sure, but I wonder whether this 11 connection may have something to do with some sort of an interface, a language interface between us and the beings, or the beings and us. And think about the numbers of people. Again, I'm making this postulate that many more people are having some form of contact vis-a-vis all of these experiences, including repeating number patterns. And there's a lot of those people.
Do you think at some point it's going to come to a head in the sense where maybe something will be ignited and everyone will wake up, or do you think we're going to continue going to sleep? I think they're building to a crisis, a critical point of awakening. But what do you think?
I think we're reaching some kind of a crescendo, but I think that because reality is so fluid and malleable, it's being written as we go. It could go in so many different directions. And, we, Alan, tend to think in terms of we as the totality of humanity. I don't know if it will be the totality of humanity that will have this realization or will be shown this. People are talking about the bifurcation of humanity and how some, Dolores Cannon talked about it as an example, some, and this doesn't mean they're better or worse, but will just be on a frequency that will not allow for the intake of these experiences consciously, and others will sort of go with the flow, so to speak, and become more immersed in it. That is where I tend to focus more of my curiosity, but I don't know. I think the book is still being written. I do, and it's being changed every day.
What is your estimate, basically, how much percentage of the U.S. population, the world population, do you think, based on all your research, and I know there's no way to prove it right now, have had abduction, contact, or some kind of ET.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say the majority of the human race has had some form of contact, given all of the parameters that we've talked about and more. I mean, we didn't even have a chance to hit on the trauma link,
Yes.
the trauma, childhood trauma, human-caused childhood trauma. That may be another show for another time. But based on all the research and all of the little dots I've connected, Alan, I am willing to say that I wouldn't be surprised if this is a worldwide phenomenon
Well,
and happening to
Yeah.
this day.
You mean like 90% of the, I don't know. I don't want to give it a number, but I would like to just, I mean, there's no way, and maybe in some future time, people will come forward and say, yeah, didn't people realize this was happening to them? And
I'm going to leave you with this, and this is important.
Okay.
Let's bring in the work of the great Rupert Sheldrake and his morphogenetic thesis, the idea that we're all linked to this field of all. Now, this might be a way out of answering your question, but it's to me, it's very important. If there is a field, we can call it the Akashic, we could call it the 0 point field, but a field that contains all information, all experience of those living and dead, all time periods, past, present, and future. And if we are inextricably linked to this field, and even if only one person on this planet has had definitive contact, then guess what? At some level, we have all experienced it through cellular memory.
Yeah.
Ergo, we are all intertwined with this experience.
Right. We're all entangled, as you're saying.
We're all entangled with it.
Because as Jung says, there's a collective consciousness, and Jung is probably another abductee, based on some of his traumatic experiences. But thank you.
He was intrigued with it. Yeah.
This is such an important conversation, Alexis. I appreciate your intelligence and your work, and this needs to be discussed in the halls of Congress. It needs to be out, and it's so radical that let's just keep having a conversation about this.
Let's absolutely do so. Thank you so much. Finally, Alan, we get to come together. I always enjoy seeing you when we're out at our events. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
No, I think you need to be on a contactee panel. I don't know why. I'm going to make sure you're on some contactee panels in the upcoming at Contact in the Desert. No, it's important. And just tell people where they can find you and all the shows you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my home online is higherjourneys.com, but I do a weekly podcast called Higher Journeys with Alexis Brooks, which can be found on YouTube and all good podcasting platforms. And we're expanding and growing. I am a long form guest based, very much like you, show. So I'm really lucky that I get to talk to some really, really fascinating people, including yourself. You were on my show not that long ago. But higherjourneys.com, I think, is probably the best place to find me. We also have launched about a year ago, more than a year ago, probably 2 years ago now, the Higher Journeys Conscious Academy, where we have people come in and guest lecture and do workshops. We've had Whitley Strieber, PMH Atwater, Cynthia Stu Larson, some great stuff over there. And you can actually access Whitley did, by the way, a fantastic workshop on how to embrace your ET contact. So that can actually be still downloaded over at the Conscious Academy website. So really good stuff.
He just came out with a new book, and you have a show on the History Channel. What's that called again?
Yes, the proof is out there. We're in season, I believe we're going into season 4 now, where I'm part of a team of subject matter experts where we talk about UFOs a lot, but also other anomalies of reality, like strange sounds, the hum, cryptids, ghostly apparitions. And I'm actually starting to collect some great footage myself. The show is primarily based on people sending in strange audio and video, and we kind of parse it. I come through as the expert that kind of puts it into context historically, and then we have a team of analysts that come in and either quantify it or say, nope, it was a hoax. So it's a great show and it's fun. Yeah.
But you're just bringing up just one final point, that all of this is the most challenging, exciting, intellectually stimulating thing I feel I could be involved with.
No doubt.
Isn't it just fantastic that
We're so
know,
blessed to get to do what we do. We
well, we
really,
chose
really
it.
are.
But
Yeah.
no, but the thing that is the great leveler is that no one understands it. We're all, not the government, not the even the experiences or the research. It's an open field for all of us to come in and have our ideas be as valid. If you've done the research, people come in and say, I know what it is. But you know, if we've done the research, you know how much, how complex, how intricate. Linda Moulton Howe calls it like a hall of mirrors with a sliding sand, quicksand
Yeah.
floor. It keeps, yeah. So I'm just,
Yeah, I think I'll end with this. I
Yeah.
think that as we continue to forge ahead, trying to parse this mystery, humility is something we must have and hold in our arsenal. The moment we think we know, there'll come along something that will just tear that apart. So let's not be so tethered to coming up with a definitive, this is what
Yeah.
it is or not.
Yeah.
If we keep humility front and center, I think we'll gain a lot of traction.
Beautiful. Thank you for your humility and your grace and your great voice too, and putting up.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
And
Alan.
thanks
All right, my
again
dear.
for today.
All right.
All right.
Okay. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.